have the pleasure of sitting with Reverend Jarrett Kerbel. So, circling back to how people feel badly about themselves, we're in the season of Lent.
Yes.
It's confession time. Confession, and there's a collective guilt, especially in New York, around racism, social justice.
Yeah.
There's a couple things there I want to ask you about. One is this collective guilt. What can we hope for?
Yeah.
What can we hope for to see it diminish, and also where is the forgiveness in this equation?
Wow, big questions. These are good. Yeah, thanks. This is big. This is a big topic right now.
Yeah.
I think a lot about this. Collective guilt. A friend of mine taught me to think of guilt as moral pain or moral injury. You know, when we're living in a way personally or part of a society collectively that is doing wrong. You know, if we're well formed in Jesus, we experience that as pain. It's painful to see other people suffer unjustly. It's painful to see inequity. It's painful to see violence. It's painful across the board. It's just, and we carry that as moral pain because something we care deeply about in our moral center has been violated. And I think that's a real experience that we have a lot, and maybe more because we're seeing more in a weird way, right? With social media and phone cameras and a lot of surveillance in the world, we're seeing more. I mean, this has already existed. It's always been there, and some communities have always seen it. And the difference now is that many communities are seeing it, right? We're now understanding, I think, from a Black perspective, what it's like to be policed. Where I grew up as a white man, I didn't know that. I had no idea. So, I think on one hand, if we think of guilt as moral pain, it's healthy. We want people to be sensitive to injustice. We want people to be sensitive to wrongs and feel when things are not right. I think we want that. Now, do we want that to be crushing and debilitating? No, we don't want that. We want this to be part of a redemptive process. We want this to be part of a healing process or a reconciling process. And this is, I think, where forgiveness comes in. But one of the big lessons, I think, especially white guys like me have learned in the last decade or more, is that we treated forgiveness a little too lightly. We felt a little too entitled to it, a little expected it to be easy. Forgiveness is a pretty challenging process. I mean, you really need to be present and absorb and understand the harm that was done, the hurt that was done. So, for example, with racism, let's take racism. I'm not a big advocate of feeling guilty about racism, except when I do something racist. Historical racism, I'm not guilty of because I didn't do a whole lot of those things that helped build it. I mean, I wasn't here for some of that stuff. However, I've benefited from it, right? That's where I come in, is I've benefited from a history of racism. And that's what I can feel have moral questions about with myself, is I am a beneficiary of a system that favors me and that's giving me advantages and opportunities and privileges that are just not given out evenly. And so, I can feel some real guilt around that. And I don't think that's a bad guilt, because I think that guilt reminds me to humble myself, to look at ways to change that landscape. It's not a self-hating guilt, it's just an acknowledgement of what's real. That's just the facts. And I'd like it not to be that way. I'd like to be part of the change. Forgiveness is really tricky. It's really, you can't rush into reconciliation with someone who's harmed. A lot of times white people move towards Black people wanting reconciliation. It's almost like we impose that construct on them. It's like they're not sure they want that, right? Maybe they want repair or reparations as a step towards reconciliation. In a real world between two people, both with consent and agency, it has to be negotiated. It can't just be done. On the other hand, I know that God's grace can create forgiveness in surprising ways. I mean, God can open our hearts in all kinds of ways to each other with a power that we can't give ourselves. So I could close my heart off with bitterness and resentment and anger and to somebody who I think has harmed me. I do it all the time. But God can reopen me to that person in ways that I don't design or plan or affect. And that's just pure insertion of grace, right? And so I think we have to pray into all these situations that we're talking about, because forgiveness is complicated. It's also a practice, right? I mean, it's a practice that I find, sorry, I'm talking a lot on this one, but I think it's a rich thing here. Sorry, am I overdoing this one?
No.
Okay. Forgiveness is to me, in its most simple form, is just being able to open my heart to the well-being of another person again, after having closed that person out. And I definitely think God's grace has to be part of that in my experience. But I also think practices need to be part of it. You know, we don't practice it that often. Churches can be very unforgiving spaces, oddly enough. We gather around this story that says we've been forgiven by God, and then we don't forgive each other. You know, we polarize, we have disagreements, we have arguments, fights, whatever, and then we never circle back to that person and say, hey, I love you and value you. I'm really sorry we're in this condition. Can we talk? You know, can we at least create space so I can hear your story and you can hear mine, and we can maybe find openness in this and start on a new path where we both have goodwill for each other again. And we've been practicing that around here some, you know, having small gatherings of two people who are alienated from each other and doing a simple process taught by Desmond Tutu and his daughter. And it really works, which is neat. You know, I think the practice of forgiveness needs to be practiced. Because in the world in general, it feels very scarce right now. It feels very hard to come by. It feels like a very judgmental world right now. It feels like we're all being held to an almost impossible standard on everything all the time. And that's hard.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me when I had shoulder injury, I couldn't rush the healing process. I had to wait.
Oh, yeah.
I had to wait a long time.
Yeah.
And then even today, I know my body doesn't really trust me to take care of it.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So there's this conflict all the time.
Yeah.
I can't will it to happen.
Right.
I have to wait for it to happen. And I think I hear some of that on a huge level. Here you're talking about whole societies that's been traumatized for generations.
Generations of trauma, yeah.
And it sometimes seems hopeless because of the scope of that.
Yeah.
So do
Wow.
you ever feel like it's beyond what we in this generation, in this time, that we can possibly hope for any change at all? Or are we just waiting for the time for another generation?
That's great. Oh, wow. I'm just really sitting with and appreciating your analogy with the body. That's really cool. Yeah, I mean, it is a humbling experience when you can't will your own healing, you know.
Yeah.
My broken arm isn't going to heal faster because I will it. I can do behaviors and practices and I can help, but I can't force it, speed it up. That's just brilliant. I think it's the same thing with society. We all play a small part in it. And what can we move within our realm of power, and what can we not move? You know, that's kind of a discernment question we ask all the time, right? How can I move this forward? How do I have to just wait, you know, or for a better time, a better moment, other forces, other leaders to happen, you know, because I am certainly not the answer to all questions. Yeah, I think it's a really mature way to look at it. You know, we sometimes you have to wait and hope for the next generation, especially in a time when there's so much change so fast.
Yeah.
It's hard to see where it's going, and it can feel very precarious.
Yeah. Let me go in a thorny direction.
Please do.
For immigrants like me who came from elsewhere,
Mhm.
had our own nation's guilt to carry, come to America, and suddenly have all of America's guilt to take on.
Wow. Yeah.
There's a service of apology coming up in the Episcopal Church,
Yes.
specifically about the slavery issue
Yes.
in America.
Yeah.
How would you advise people like me who are immigrants who transplanted to take on that, and what should be our goal?
Wow.
in that?
That's a great question. I have to think about that. That's a really challenging question. Right, because as a relatively recent immigrant, your family going back didn't participate in this structure of injustice and oppression, right? So you've come into a story in progress that you didn't have any part in building. So I could see in some way that a service like that could be, something for other people to do, right? Because they have more complicity. Like on my mother's side of the family, we were on the wrong side of the Civil War. What I think of the wrong side of the Civil War, we fought for the Confederacy. We weren't slave owners because we were too poor, but we were there on the wrong side. So for me, I definitely have participation in this thing, and I've benefited from it, and I can trace the benefits of being a white man, right? So for me, there's a tremendous meaning in taking part in that. I would have to really bow before more recent immigrants and ask them what they think. I would make myself the student in this question, right? What's your experience? How do you think it fits or does not fit? But make sure to leave space, right? Because I don't know. It's not my story, in some really profound ways, Every other year I teach a class at Princeton Theological Seminary, and one year our Korean students were really asking for more focus on the Korean church. I don't know anything about the Korean church. So we brought in a professor who specialized in it to do that. And it was brilliant, and I took notes and I learned a lot. But it's kind of one of those humble moments where it's like, I would like to advise you, but it would have to be a real conversation because I'd have to learn more about your experience, about your perspective. So I feel like I can only speak in the most general terms.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I just want to acknowledge that it's a very complicated question for me as an Asian living in Harlem, and there's a lot of anger in Harlem, and it's been hard for me to fit in.
Yeah. Sure.
To figure out how I can be a good neighbor, but at the same time, doesn't always feel safe.
Sure.
And
absolutely.
It's yeah. And so the real question is, what is the goal, and what does a good neighbor look like?
That's a great question.
That situation.
It's a great question. I mean, right. So you're in a neighborhood with a long history and people who've experienced, generational trauma that comes with being a historically poor and black neighborhood and within the kind of enslavement history of the United States. So when I'm interacting with somebody, I'm interacting with all their history or how that's damaged them, how that's hurt them, how that's caused them to be suspicious, angry, frustrated, and they're seeing me through that experience, right? So I really think the work has to be relational and long-term, right? Like immediate moments of interaction can be very challenging because, someone's already very angry, right? Or someone's already very suspicious. So I think it takes time and it takes community. And in that case, like one of the things we're going to work on here is All Angels partnering with a historically black Episcopal church. And we would put like a 5 to 10 year horizon on this, right? So where we'd worship together, we'd Bible study together, we'd pray together. We're not here to help them, and they're not here to teach us. We're here to learn how to be together. Because a lot of the story I learned when I worked in Trenton, New Jersey is I worked in downtown New Jersey, and I'm just the latest white guy to show up to try to help people. So no one wants to commit to me. No one's going to think I'm going to stay there very long, right? Because that's happened over and over again. So it takes this long-term historical commitment. It takes an investment. It takes an investment in my own personal discomfort. Someone said this to me the other day, and it kind of blew my mind because it was so right. Is one of the things people of privilege like me need to do is invest in or commit to being in really uncomfortable spaces and being okay with that for the long term. Because one of the things white privilege does is protect my comfort. So, yeah, I have to be in uncomfortable relationships with people for years and years before they're going to trust me and before the next thing happens. So I think a lot of times we underestimate the time, the duration that's needed to make a dent in these deep histories.
Absolutely. That's so exciting for you to say that. I'm just thinking about when I teach adult students, and they feel so awkward. And I think one of my superpowers that I can offer them is sitting with their awkwardness.
Yes.
And I practice that myself by going to dance class where I can be the awkward student.
Oh, that's amazing. That's cool.
Because it draws me closer to what they're experiencing.
I love that. That's so cool. I can barely get through it. I feel so self-conscious and so stupid and so unable.
What did you do?
I took a drum lesson.
Great.
Something I've always wanted to try, and I think I am totally against the grain of my abilities. And
that's the best. Yeah. That's such a quick growth when we're in an awkward situation.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing with me about that.